Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the differences between hard science fiction, soft science fiction, and fantasy. So the difference between hard and soft science fiction is basically that hard science fiction focuses on things that are at least theoretically possible. A good example of hard science fiction is Jurassic Park. The Jurassic Park novel especially goes very deep into the science of how the dinosaurs are created, the computer code of the system that keeps the park secure, that obviously ultimately fails, and it questions very seriously whether it would be right to do something like this, or whether it's just a bad idea that needs to be avoided. Which, spoiler alert, it's a bad idea that needs to be avoided, at least according to the author of Jurassic Park. On the other hand, an example of soft science fiction would be something like Star Trek. It's all about exploring strange new worlds, meeting new civilizations, mostly humanoid aliens with something weird on their nose or forehead or ears because, making CGI aliens that look truly alien is expensive. We're going faster than the speed of light. We're getting past the event horizon of a black hole, but then being able to break free anyway. We're breaking the laws of physics, and we're deviating from what's actually likely or possible. But that's not really important because the story is about traveling from planet to planet, exploring strange new worlds. So the difference, I guess, between soft science fiction and fantasy is largely that one of them purports to be about science, whereas the other one admits that what's happening is not possible. What I mean by that is that faster than light space travel in particular is just flat out impossible. There are, theories about hyperspace or warp drives or whatever that, yes, get used very effectively in soft science fiction stories. But it's not really widely believed that that would be possible, certainly not in the near future or even ever. And those stories often don't take into account things like time dilation, for instance, which is actually a more hard science fiction type concept that comes into effect as you approach the speed of light. On the other hand, though, faster than light space travel still deals with space travel, spaceships, exploring the galaxy. And that's very much a science fiction kind of concept. It takes place in the future, imagines what might be out there beyond our own planet, whereas fantasy typically takes place either in the present day, in the past, or in an alternate world that's very different from our own, not on another planet, but just in a completely imaginary world. Like, think of Narnia, Oz, or Middle-earth. The things that happen don't really have a scientific explanation at all, not even a very obviously unscientific one. There's no attempt made at a scientific explanation. It's just, yes, magic works this way, or yes, unicorns and dragons definitely exist. On the other hand, there is a lot of gray area. There are things that basically are fantasy, but that get thought of as science fiction because they do involve time travel, space travel, or something involving the future. And there also are fantasy stories that do attempt something of a scientific explanation, even if it's really not a scientific one. What I'm thinking of there is Shadow and Bone and all of its sequels and spin-offs and whatnot, where magic is not really described as magic at all. It's called the small science. And it basically is described as dealing with real natural processes. The characters who are able to heal, all they really do is speed up or enhance the process of healing that your body already knows to do. While it's definitely a fantasy magic system, it calls itself science and it tries to kind of pretend to be science. Now, I'm not saying that Shadow and Bone is science fiction, but I think it's interesting that as a fantasy story, it brings science into the explanation for its magic system. On the other hand, Star Wars is very obviously science fiction on the surface. It involves interstellar travel, it involves droids, which are basically intelligent robots, it involves aliens, a galactic empire, but there's so much fantasy in it as well. There is no scientific explanation for the Force, and when a scientific explanation is presented, fans don't tend to like to talk about midichlorians that much. The Force being like this mystical, mysterious thing that nobody quite understands, that's something that's essential to Star Wars, not something that needed to be remedied. And it's very widely known that Star Wars follows the hero's journey, which I guess technically could be applied to any genre, but it's a very common story structure for fantasy. What about A Wrinkle in Time? Is that science fiction or fantasy? On the one hand, It's definitely a journey about traveling between different planets. But on the other hand, the way that they do it, it's very much like magic. Or what about Doctor Who? Is that science fiction or fantasy? On the surface, it's definitely science fiction. The main character is an alien from another planet. They travel in time and space in basically an alien spaceship. But is there anything actually scientific about any of it? Usually not. At best you get kind of technobabble involving like reverse the polarity and stuff like that. But often it's almost like fantasy. There are even episodes that involve things like witches, vampires, werewolves, and so on and so forth that, yes, turn out to be aliens, but are otherwise basically indistinguishable from their mythological or fantasy kind of counterparts. Another example that I have of something that blurs the lines between science fiction and fantasy is The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. They're basically retellings of fairy tales, but set in a high-tech dystopian future. They involve space travel, although only to the moon or a satellite and back, not to other planets or other solar systems. They involve genetic engineering, but they also involve basically magic, but that's like portrayed as science. Like all of the stuff that the Lunars can do. That's very much like magic. The whole like creating an illusion thing. And then of course there's the fact that they're based on fairy tales, although the more fantastical elements of the fairy tale usually don't appear. Cinderella doesn't really have a fairy godmother in this version, for instance, and the witch keeping Rapunzel in a satellite rather than a tower visits via spaceship, not Rapunzel letting down her hair. And then as an example of a fantasy series that crosses over into science fiction, the Young Wizards series. The first book is titled So You Want to Be a Wizard. The main characters are described as wizards. What they do is described as magic, but it gets very sciencey and even involves things like computer technology and traveling to other planets. Is it fantasy or is it science fiction? Different books might lean different ways, but it seems like it mostly falls right in the middle of the two. And then finally, I'm currently reading The Time Traveler's Wife, and I really can't decide whether it's science fiction or fantasy. On the one hand, the involuntary time traveling is portrayed as a disease, and he's seeing a doctor about it, and it seems kind of scientific. But then on the other hand, there's something very kind of fantasy about the way that it works as well. It's not really given that much of a scientific explanation. It's not like we're told, this was the result of a genetic experiment gone wrong, or he has a time travel device that he can't control when it activates, or anything like that. It's just this thing that happens to him that scientists in the future are kind of trying to understand. The name given to this gray area between science fiction and fantasy is science fantasy, and as I just demonstrated, it can include a lot of things. Science fiction that crosses over into fantasy, fantasy that crosses over into science fiction, basically anything that blurs the lines between the two genres, that goes more towards the truly impossible even than soft science fiction, but is a little bit more scientific, or tries to be a little bit more scientific, or seems on the surface a little more scientific than just plain straight out fantasy.